Thank you, Arpit. Thanks a lot for joining today. I know you are very busy, so thanks a lot for giving time today, especially on a weekend. So, before we proceed, if you can briefly introduce yourself about your profile and background, so we can proceed accordingly. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Maninder. Firstly, I think I must thank you for following up so rigorously on creating this content, particularly on logistics. I think it is significantly growing in importance as we are moving forward, specifically with the overall supply chain network being an important pillar for growth across sectors and not only the development. Uh, my name is Arpit. I head the logistics and customer service function for Godrej Consumers, which is the FMCG arm of Godrej for India and South Cluster. I've been with the present organization for about 10 years, and I've been in this field for about close to around 10 plus years. And did a bunch of roles which is in and around essentially around supply chain, but have been focused majority of my career in either inventory planning or logistics per se. So yeah, so I'm looking forward to this session, and thank you again for offering me the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Arpit. Thank you. Okay, so to start with logistics, very big landscape.
Mm.
Um, so many things to understand. But considering the purpose of today's video, if you can briefly explain on overall level what logistics is and what does it mean when it comes to global logistics, or when we say, okay, this company has these type of logistics, these are the logistics operation, this is a strategic logistics, just to briefly help audience understand the differences between these things. Yeah.
Uh, in a nutshell, and in not entirely limiting it to FMCG, logistics would typically mean anything which is on the move. So
Okay.
be it any raw material, packing material, be it any particular product which is there, be it any services which you typically go about offering. If it is on the move, that would essentially be captured in a subpart of logistics. And essentially, different organizations have created their respective supply chains or value chains in a way which is logical to them. And essentially, uh, not all organizations might encompass all the activities which they undertake under logistics function. Effectively, anything which is on the move is, to a layman's language, is something that would come under logistics. Now, there are two broad cuts to logistics in a consumer sector. So to consumer product sector, to be specific, which is either FMCG, FMCD, beverages, anything which you are delivering an actual product to the customer. One is obviously an inbound consumer, which is basically products gets made from individual constituents. It gets picked up from their vendors, travels to the factory, and where the magic happens, essentially the final product gets created. And then there is something which is called an outbound logistics, which is saying that how does will that product travel to the final consumer. And effectively in an FMCG domain, while we typically restrict the supply chain essentially only up to billing to the first channel partner, which is either a distributor, a particular chain, an income partner. Effectively, logistics would encompass all the activities which is there from the factory to the final consumer, and not essentially limit to what the organization supply chain domain is. So that essentially would encompass the overall logistics. Typically, when we talk about the logistics sector as a whole, specifically in a sector like FMCG, that is limited to an outbound logistics, which is based once the factory creates the particular product, how will it travel to the first customer, not the consumer, which is saying that how will it travel to my first distributor, my first channel partner, be it my first e-com partner. And essentially is how can I best service one, the demand which is being created at the concerned customer's end. Secondly, with the required amount of speed which I need to service that particular customer.
Okay.
So these are two things that walk hand in hand when we talk about essentially the logistics space.
Okay.
Okay. The second piece, which is key to ensuring an FMCG outbound logistics, is something which is called inventory planning, which is saying that FMCG basically is made to stock rather than made to order, which is saying that effectively, if I go to purchase to a retail store and you want to purchase a soap, right? Effectively, you will not postpone your purchasing that I will take a bath tomorrow because a certain soap is not available, right?
Correct.
Effectively, it is important for the concerned brand, and be it ours or be it anybody else's, to ensure that that is present at the particular store prior to you walking into the store and purchasing it. The same is true for you buying a particular product from, say, a Swiggy Instamart or say a Flipkart, right? You that particular product needs to be available in their DC or in their store prior to you coming onto the platform and looking for that particular site. And essentially, that would mean that there is a certain amount of inventory which is automatically needs to be maintained at various junctures of supply chain.
Okay.
Now, for in the layman terms, you anybody would understand that if there is an inventory, there is a particular product which is maintained, it tantamounts to cost, right? So
Mm.
there is now cost can be borne by the organization, it can be borne by the customer, it can be borne by the consumer, but ultimately, if you look at the end-to-end supply chain, it is a cost which is there, which is being passed on to the final product. And essentially, that is one piece which effectively works hand in hand with your logistical efficiency to ensure that the better your logistical efficiency is, your inventory is optimized in the correct manner, and hence you are able to reach your final consumer as quick as possible. And
Mm.
that essentially not only limited to the organizations carrying the inventory, that would also mean the chain carrying optimum amount of inventory, the retail store or the wholesale carrying optimum amount of inventory, as well as the pantry, which is your consumer carrying a lot of inventory. So I think that encompasses, in a nutshell, the overall end-to-end space of logistics, which I
Okay.
think what is something which through Gati Shakti also, which we are trying to optimize.
Nice. So you talked about inbound, you talked about outbound, and in outbound, you explained about the relevance of inventory planning and the different stages. I think you mentioned about wholesalers, distributors, consumers, retail stores, and the related part of the chain as a whole. Uh, Under logistics in outbound also, if I understand correctly, there are subcategories like movement from plant to distributor, wholesaler, or then to consumers. So do we have certain kind of definitions for that as well? Like how do we define those parts of the logistics?
So essentially, this might vary from one organization to the other.
Okay.
In an FMCG context, so I will first probably tell anything which is till the ownership of the goods belongs to a certain organization.
Okay.
That particular logistics or that particular leg of logistics in logistics parlance we would largely call as primary logistics, which
Okay.
we would say that that is my primary leg that I'm trying to cover till the ownership belongs to the organizer. The, the point wherein the ownership transfer to the first customer, which is basically in sales parlance would call your primary sales, that would be secondary logistics, which is
Okay.
saying that is the this is your secondary leg wherein now the ownership has been transferred to the first customer. After that, typically there is a tertiary leg, which typically organizations don't take care of themselves. Basically, it would be their channel partners or customers that would be taking care of the tertiary logistics on their behalf, which would be how do you translate the goods from the customer to the consumer. So these are
Okay.
three broad legs, we would say, and obviously there are organizations who would define it in much more detail, essentially. But the broad definition would such in an FMCG.
Okay. Okay. So some sections of these out of primary, secondary, tertiary, some are kind of not under control of the organization who are manufacturing the products, and some are somewhere related to the part of the organization.
Yes, so there are certain products for which uh, we have tried to sort of ensure that if we can have a single leg of delivery from combining primary and secondary,
Okay.
there are aspects which there are pilots which are going on, which I will talk later. while we progress with this particular session, wherein organizations have also gone in to say that why don't I service the final retailer, which is saying that my
Hmm.
primary, secondary, and tertiary directly consume, only the consumer needs to walk into my store and purchase it directly.
Okay.
So that is a changing instance in terms of the way you define it, and where which is where the definition of primary, secondary, and tertiary gets slightly delivered.
Okay. Okay. So when we talk about these subcategories in the primary landscape, so if we take any typical organization, it could be FMCG or some other sector as well. So how the team structure looks like, who takes care of logistics, like briefly, I know that it will be very different in different organizations, but generally, like what type of, who will be taking care of the primary logistics, like are there different roles, or like how the structure looks like in this part of the organization?
Uh, for To answer this question, I would like to sort of divide two basic aspects of logistics, or
Okay.
the two basic criteria or pillars on why logistics function as a whole exists in say
Okay.
something like a product industry. One is service, which is saying that effectively my job as a logistics service provider is to ensure that I can service you with speed with the required product at the correct point in time, which is something which in a supply chain parlance somebody would call loaded, right? It's on
Okay.
time and in full.
Okay.
The second part of it is, which typically has grown of importance in the last 10 years since I have been a part of this industry, has been the cost, which is saying
Mm.
that what is the cost that you need to do while you are servicing this particular leg or any particular leg in this part of our business. So the first piece, which is essentially service, is something which is taken care in jointly by the inventory planning team and logistics. So, for example, there are organizations wherein there would be inventory planners, there would be a primary transportation team who would be servicing the primary leg, and then there is a secondary transportation team or the secondary inventory planners who would be based out of regions typically, because effectively that the number of touch points which the secondary leg typically touches is much higher as compared to the primary touch points. So as just to give a figure, the ratio would be 1 is to 50. So for example, for one primary point that I have, I would be touching 50 secondary points
Okay.
that I
Okay.
have in terms of secondary or distributor or customer setups,
Okay.
which is where effectively you would have regional logistic managers or regional logistics team who would be taking care of the respective service of a particular region
Mm.
and trying to ensure that both in terms of inventory maintenance, the IRA, the overall hygiene of inventory, as well as the overall service to the final customer is done appropriately. So that is a service part of it.
Okay.
Now, coming to the cost part is something which is there are different organizations who are based out different. There
Mm.
are organizations which have said that there is a maker checker concept, which says that
Okay.
the person who provides the service should not be the person who sort of decides the cost. And then
Okay.
there should be a counterbalance force whenever you are trying to sort
Mm.
of look at what is the service that is being provided and essentially what is the X amount of cost that is being incurred for it. And there are teams which are there within procurement or sourcing who look at indirect services. So
Okay.
to say wherein comes the logistics part. There are organizations wherein we have said that given the amount of agility that is required, effectively the cost part is maintained within the logistics team itself. So there is a primary sourcing team which is there within logistics, and similarly there is a regional sourcing team which is typically the roles in at regional level, given that the cost is typically comparatively less or as well as very regionally dependent, that gets merged with the regional logistics division. The regional logistics team would take care of both the cost and the service, and similarly the primary logistics team would take care of both the cost and the service. So both type of structures typically exist, and we have seen results through both. There are pros and cons to both the approaches, and effectively depends on the organization and the priorities that the organization looks like, as well as the global structure that the organization comes from, is which particular structure or particular organization is going to prefer.
Correct. Correct. No, no, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. So, in nutshell, it's a job of multiple teams. Managing logistics is not easy. So that's what I wanted to understand from you. It's a very big sub landscape under handling logistics end to end for any organization, with some changes here and there depending on the structure of the organization. Um, I was listening to one of the interviews by Mr. Gadkari's recently about it was about infrastructure, how the growth is happening in India and globally, with special focus on India. So he mentioned that logistics currently has a very big contribution in the cost, which is not good actually. Like we can optimize it at to a certain level to meet the global benchmarks, and somewhere infrastructure will play a very critical role, and there are multiple other factors also. So now, if I pick that comment from his statement, so if you can briefly help us understand, okay, what exactly does it mean, and what kind of optimizations he must have been talking about, or companies are currently looking at, and what are the key challenges in this space currently, specifically if I talk about India with respect to the world globally.
Uh, Roughly, I don't think FMCG would be the correct benchmark when you look at logistics cost. But if you look at the logistics cost as such in terms of final delivery, it is close to about what was reflected by earlier in the statement. Mr. Tertiary was around 14% of the GDP, whereas in
Okay,
some of the developed economies, it is close to about 7-8%.
this is of what? Like
Effectively,
this 14-15% is of
this
what?
is the this of the India's GDP. So, what
Okay.
exactly the cost
Okay.
that we incur on logistics is about 14% of our GDP. Effectively, in some of the global economies or the developed economies, that would be close to around 7 to 8% of
Okay.
their
Okay.
respective GDP, which says that in terms of there are two things that is critical. One is that obviously the amount of infra investment that we should be doing on the quality of infra, not
Mm,
essentially only amount in terms of the roads, but the quality of roads, essentially the quality of trucks, the quality of infrastructure that we have, essentially something that needs to go on overhauling, and which I think it can be as basic as having which majority of the people have said having non-AC driver cabins, right? It has not exactly been a mandatory requirement up till recently. As on date, even they would be majority of primary trucks that would be running without a non-AC driver cabin, and that would be covering long hauls of as big as say 1,500 to 2,000 kilometers.
mm,
So which is becomes a huge challenge when you look at the overall infra, which is where you have double driver concept, you have essentially people who are not specialized enough
mm,
to uh, to take care of the primary infrastructure, the primary transportation. So the second part which is important, which has happened, is that in terms of where is the connectivity in terms of the far-fetched areas. So you would feel that while the golden quadrangle, or specifically the metro part, is something which is largely connected, there are large chunk of rural hinterlands which are still not as well connected in terms of the logistics infra as should be in a growing economy like India, and which I think the focus has been significantly is to how do you increase the speed to connect the even the rural hinterlands of India to the mainstream, and ensure that you reduce that speed as a
okay.
whole. The third major piece is that in terms of the quality of warehousing, which has gone a major overhauling, and I would credit I think the e-com boom in India to that piece, which has led to a massive change. One, in terms of the investments that we've done on warehousing. Secondly, in terms of the throughput that is there in terms of warehousing. So essentially, if you go 10 years back when I had joined in this industry, you would find that majority of the warehouses that I had been to were manual. We would hardly find somebody which is being used mechanized warehouses. You had vertical warehouses even then, but essentially the movement within the warehouse was largely manual. So you would have people picking up stocks and essentially doing manual work. I think that has significantly changed in the last decade as such. So you would now have warehouses which are ASRS enabled, for which you have AGVs within the warehouses. The quality of flooring within the warehouses is significantly improved. You would have warehouses wherein you can store significantly larger volume as compared to what you used to do earlier, because the capacity of warehouse to grow vertical has gone significantly. What
Hmm.
it has, and obviously it has led to, because of the technical ingenuity also. This other part of it is the ability to invest in these kind of infrastructure, and understanding the importance and the throughput of the warehouse is been significantly something which has changed. So
Hmm.
what I would say in a short sentence is that warehouses have gone on from becoming storage places to throughput places, which is
Hmm.
saying that effectively earlier people used to refer as like my so warehouse can store y cases of product. Now the question is about if my X warehouse can deliver or dispatch so quantity of products to so many customers. So effectively that has gone from a storage location to a throughput. I
Okay.
see these are the two major changes that has been there in the parlance. And FMCG is, I would say, behind the curve, to be very, very honest, and that would be an honest confession. So we are catching up with some of these industries, and largely a large chunk of it is because we are still much lesser. The logistics cost as a part of the overall supply chain and the overall cost for the company, the percentage contribution of logistics cost to the overall gross contribution of the organization is still comparatively less for FMCG as compared to some of the other industries.
Okay. So which other industry is closer to FMCG as a whole? Like they are able to optimize it still better than others,
So I would not say that in terms of
or it's not
uh,
industry based. It's like overall.
I would not say that it is dependent on SM. It is not dependent on who is able to better optimize it. It is basically dependent on the kind of industry and the way you reach your consumer.
Okay.
Uh, so, for example, a beverage industry, right, would have much higher costs as compared to something like an FMCG. And why? Because effectively it is highly, highly seasonal,
Hmm.
which is saying that from one season from May to October, the demand can swing as low as 0.2, 0.3x, and effectively, which would mean that your source to your supply has to be the kilometer that you travel has to be very, very low as compared to an FMCG or industry. The second part of it is it also depends on the kind of industry which is there. So, in terms of the food industry, the shelf life of a particular product determines on what is the kind of inventory that you need to maintain.
Right.
Soap might have a shelf life of about 2 years.
Hmm.
Milk packet has a shelf life of only 48 hours. So
Hmm.
that effectively determines the amount of inventory that you need to maintain, and the more closer you need to be to your consumer, effectively would warrant much distributed supply chain, which would increase the cost. So I would say
Okay.
it depends on the kind of industry as versus somebody else is doing better than others.
Correct, correct. And it's very complex. Like so many, you have mentioned few variables, and I'm sure there must be so many other variables as well to determine how to optimize overall logistics part of the supply chain for sure. So I will pick these points which you just mentioned, where you covered about the shelf life of the products. For example, in FMCG, we have so many perishable goods. Further in FMCG also there are multiple types of FMCGs. Then we have demand volatility, like what you mentioned about seasons and all. And then there is a lot of competition happening in the industry, which in itself is resulting into overall benefit of the logistic landscape. If you are doing this work on daily basis, you know the in and outs of everything. So if you have to share with us, with all of us who is watching this, who will be watching this video, that what kind of challenges you face on daily basis. Some would be very small but very impactful. Some would be very big but not that impactful, and some challenges which people can't think about because they get the product on time, and but they don't know what is happening at the backside of this whole process. But when they will understand, okay, this also happens, okay, that also happens, and they will realize, okay, it is not that easy. Like in those cases, if we can do.
Yeah, so I think there are two things which you asked, right? One part which you asked is that in terms of what are the various challenges that we face, and effectively some challenges which is known to the organization and essentially the outside public, and some challenges which is not known to the outside. Uh, in terms of, I think there are two major things that is significantly different from a challenge standpoint. One challenge key is that the focus on cost, which I've said, right? Because of in terms of the overall penetration, the majority of the category increasing, and specifically, if we remove the exception of COVID, you would see that majority of the categories are essentially flattish, which is where what happens is that for any organization, organization's category to grow or a brand to grow, sorry, you would need to acquire market share versus the other. And essentially, because of which, what happens is that there is a cutthroat competition, and essentially the amount of volume as well as value growth that you used to see in the FMCG sector, which was there about a decade and a half back, is no more. And essentially, the focus now has been to get value growth as much as possible, but to try and ensure that your EBITDA, your P&L, your profit growth are in line with the expectations, specifically in case of bigger organizations listed on. So I think that has changed significantly. So the amount of focus that has gone in terms of cost has gone significantly up as far as
Okay.
the overall piece is concerned. Second, what has happened in the during the same duration is that because of the boom in e-commerce and specifically of the higher growth which is there in modern trade, higher growth which we have seen in direct to consumer channel, there are various channels which have emerged which have specific requirements. So e-com has a very specific requirement in terms of shelf life, in terms of delivery schedule, in terms of batch sizing, in terms of code, in terms of the way they would want to go about billing it. And essentially, because of which, what happens is that your traditional supply chain or traditional logistics network, which was typically designed to cater to traditional trade or general trade or the distributor setup, is something that is going onto an overhaul,
Okay.
and which is where the concern has come in, because you need to ensure that 80% of your or 75% of your logistic network services the final distributor, but the balance 25% has to be gear up to ensure that they can service specific customers at a particular point in time with specific needs, with specific inventory, which has become a very difficult mix to balance as when we go ahead, and simultaneously that has grappled up with costs. So I think these are two things that has gone significantly up. Uh, One thing which has obviously been an advantage to us in terms of not in terms of easing out our issues in terms of the growth that we have seen in the infrastructure. So if I were to take about say 7 8 years back, our one primary transportation truck used to run about 300 kilometers a day. And that used to be a very good run in terms of when you look at the average timings of a truck. Right now, you would say that the same transporters would run, say, close to about 450 to 500 kilometers.
Hmm. Yeah.
So your ability to reach the customer, your speed to reach the customer has gone up significantly with no major investment in terms from the organization side. And obviously that has gone up significantly in terms of the tolls have gone up, in terms of the diesel rate has gone up, and so there are secondary costs which have gone up. But effectively, your ability to reach the customer and reach the further points of your value chain has gone significantly what it was about 10 years.
Okay. Okay. Uh, Operationally, I this part I know. I don't know whether you face this, but I'm sure you must be facing this. So, in one of my earlier roles, so in procurement only, our role included the delivery part as well, like not only the sourcing part, but the delivery to the sites part as well, end-to-end procurement. In that role, what I primarily learned about delivery or the last mile for our internal customer, basically which are plants, is that it is very difficult to rely on the transportation part of logistics because of the dynamics it involves. For example, the behavior of the driver, We don't know how many days the driver is has not been to the home. So they might not be in a good mood someday. They will not drive more than 200 kilometers. Sometimes there's something will happen to the vehicle, and they are like, we can't do anything. You talk to my owner, and this is and sometimes I don't know whether this happens now or not, but yes, I have seen some cases where the vehicle which was sent was X, and the vehicle which reached was Y. So like very small issues, but operationally, like the teams cannot ignore it. Do these things happen now?
They do happen. So I would not say that there are operational challenges in terms of the overall aspect of specifically in the secondary leg where you don't have full truck loads. You
Okay.
are forced to create parcel loads, which is forced basically the secondary transporters to club loads. Essentially, that happens still to the day. I would say, and that would continue to be the way of operations effectively till India or the overall FMCG setup works in a way wherein you have significant amount of improvement as far as infrastructure is concerned. I would say this would be the process. What I would say has been different is that the checks and balances which is there around the transportation has gone. So
Okay.
earlier there was no concept of a control tower,
Yeah.
and specifically in a warehouse, right?
Yes.
Now there is a concept of control tower, so you know have when the vehicle is going in, when it was put on to the loading dock, when it is going out, and effectively you do have that. You do not have same base tracking. Now
Hmm.
you have sim-based tracking, which is there, which effectively goes to show in majority of the TMS solutions, which is there. You have ULIP being created through the infrastructure, which is there as an integrated platform for things.
Hmm.
So I would say there is another concept of a digital lock which is coming in, say in FTL, wherein you put a lock and effectively that is gets transshipped to the final location, and that
Hmm.
ensures the ingenuity of the final things. So I would say that in terms of operational challenges and the sanctity of the process, yes, it is not 100%, but it has gone up significantly in what it was, say, maybe 10 years before. Having said that, uh, you would see that majority of the FMCG setup, right, 70 to 75% of this business skills comes from traditional trade, which
Hmm.
is there is that classic distributor setup from which the distributor would go to a retailer or a wholesaler, and then the retailer would service the final consumer. That is still the classic setup. So three-fourths of your business is still coming from that for majority of the FMCG organizations,
Hmm.
which would mean that there at a distributor level there is a partial truckload being formed, and effectively which is there, and according to the cost pressures, effectively what you will need to do is sort of club it along with other loads to ensure that it reaches the final customer, which is where these kind of issues typically tend to occur. So I would say it is a question of sort of need versus service. I would say whether the need is there to create a full truckload to the final leg, because that is going to come with a cost. And
Hmm.
effectively, your ability to service faster should give you that additional revenue to cover up that cost. Till that is not the case, you are okay with living a one-off scenario here and there, and going with a partial truck. So I would
Good.
say it depends on the maturity of the industry. I don't think FMCG is there quite as yet, specifically in the secondary leg as well.
Hmm. Okay. Okay. Interesting. Interesting. But it's good to know that the checks or balances have increased, because I know that that part of actually the problem with that part of the chain is that sometimes you have a certain emergency in terms of deliveries, and if you don't get the loads on time because of the reliability issue, it becomes difficult. But I know that there will be very rare cases when this happens. But if the checks and balances have increased, I'm sure that at least the reliability must have increased a lot in last few years, like what you mentioned.
Yeah.
When you explained about the logistics part, you mentioned inventory planning. And when you were explaining on the roles also as a part of the logistics overall, you mentioned about inventory planners. Then we have a team who does demand forecasting as well, basis which the logistics planning also happen in one or the other way. And then accordingly, the transportation optimization also play a crucial role. If briefly you can link the demand forecasting part and the transport optimization and daily work. The team who is part of the logistics, they do that, how it works generally in a very brief manner, so that if someone wants to understand, okay, how they are interlinked, the demand forecasting part and inventory planners, which you already explained, and then the transportation planning part. If briefly you can help to understand how it works.
Uh, so if you talk about logistics, logistics is essentially physical movement of goods.
Yeah.
Starts from your supplier to your factory to your say mother hub warehouse, and then to the final CNFA, and then to the final consumer. The
Mm,
physical flow. Now look at the way data flows back.
mm,
Right, data flows back right from the end of the value chain to the upstream. So, for example, you would start with the consumer, then you would create CFA level demand, then you would finalize your production plan, and then you would say that what RMPM do I need to make. So
mm,
your physical flow of good is moving from X to Y. Your data essentially, which runs the overall chain as a feedback mechanism, flows from Y to X.
mm.
Right,
Okay.
and essentially that chain sort of keeps the overall value chain going.
Mm,
Without data you cannot make the physical flow of goods, which
correct.
is where any particular supply chain would start, specifically in a product industry, would start with demand. So you would start with the consumer so that you can end to the consumer. You
Mm,
cannot start with your RMPM vendor saying that my vendor has got X supply, so this is what I will supply to the consumer,
mm,
right?
yeah.
Effectively, you would say what the consumer would want, and
Mm,
that becomes a starting point to the journey of the physical value chain. So that is where the demand forecasting would typically kick in. Is demand forecasting tells us saying a X consumer would want, and hence what is the amount of inventory that needs to maintain at a distributor, what is the amount of inventory that needs to maintain at a CFA, and what is the production plan that needs to be taken. And essentially that is left to the inventory planner to then decide basis the inventory, the individual capacity on what can be produced to optimize the overall cost as well as service. And hence essentially that data comes back to the MRP planners, which is your material requirement planners, which would be a part of your inventory planning team, safety planners, and divide the MRP planner. And then that MRP planner would pass the baton
mm,
to your executors, who are your physical providers, which would be either your procurement people, or be it your or factory persons, or
mm,
your manufacturing clusters, and then be it the final logistics service providers, to
mm.
physically ensure the movement of the goods through the data. So I would say, uh, to put it in a nutshell, I would say logistic would run on is a railway which runs on the track which is made by data, which is there possible through inventory planning and demand forecasting.
Awesome, awesome. Very good and very brief, very simple to understand. Thanks a lot. This is what I wanted from you. Okay, so we are coming to the last section of our discussion.
Yeah.
So I will cover two key points. The first key point is the logistic service providers. Um, is majority of it is currently outsourced for all the companies? Like, or do some companies still own some part of it? Like, how?
It depends on the scale, I would say.
Okay.
Majority of there are organizations even in FMCG. Effectively, I would not be able to name any
Yeah, yeah.
organization here,
Yes.
but there are organizations who have sort of out kept a part of their value chain run by themselves.
Okay.
However, if you look at a general parlance, you would see that majority of the service in the LSPs are outsourced.
Outsourced. So in outsourced part, do we, if I'll talk about India specifically, do we have a, good supplier base, or the companies who are able to provide good services in terms of the fleet, plus good drivers, plus the solutions they provide? For example, some companies I know personally who are able to give a digital tracking as well. They have GPS
Yeah.
trackers, and then they, one key element is that they always say that our drivers are working with us from last 10-20 years. We have such a good reliability, our drivers are not changing, we our vehicles are owned by us 80% of them, we hardly rely on the market for 20% in case we need any, or like on the similar lines. So is Indian landscape of companies who provide these services, is it still in the initial state, or they are already mature, according to you?
I would say they're in the process of maturing.
Okay.
So if you again traditionally we have had traditional players
Okay.
into the CFA or the transportation or the logistics setup. We would say that you would have asset heavy players, which would say that I would can become a transporter if I only have 100 trucks. I can be a warehouse service provider if I'll have X number of organizations in my bag, or if I have X number of warehouses who are outsourced. I think that has changed. So now essentially what has happened is there are two things which is there. One is that there are aggregators, there are freight aggregators who have come into the market, with saying that we focus on keeping their asset light. And
Okay.
the advantage of keeping asset light is that they can invest behind technology, which
Mm.
is saying that GPS enabled tracks, SIM enablement, control towers, etc., etc., in terms of providing better visibility to the final customer. In this case, say an organization like Godrej Consumers.
Okay.
So I would say that has been changed. So traditional LSPs have moved from asset heavy to asset light.
Okay.
Second thing which has happened is, which I partially covered the first half, is the focus on technology has gone up.
Mm.
You would see the basic processes of how do you go about loading in a truck, right?
Mm.
Have gone on from manual process, so it is left to the labor or the warehouse supervisor to load the truck in the way that he feels, up to the maximum truck capacity. Now there are algorithms which are available, which tell you how should you go about loading the truck
Okay.
to best utilize the space. The same is true for, say, control towers within the warehouse. The same is true for, say, transport management system solutions, so which is where you say that there's a TMS solution now enabled, which says that if I know, want to transport X number of cases from point A to point B, which truck would be best suited for transporting it at the lowest cost. That
Mm.
is what, that is not a manual call now. That is something which a TMS solution will tell you. So I think there are two things which has significantly changed. Having said that, in a country as diverse as India, and specifically with these many distributor channel partners, these many geographies and terrains, you would always have regional service providers who can reach a particular town. So I would still have not have a 3PL or a very mechanized setup to reach a secondary consumer, say as remote as Imphal or Agartala in Northeast,
Mm.
right? You would still be dependent on regional players to reach those points. Why? Because it's effectively that is the regional know-how that sort of ensures the flow of good is unhindered. Having said that, the long hauls have changed significantly. The regional, the secondary leg of transportation is something which is evolving.
Mm. Okay. So according to you, in the future also, uh, we cannot say that the companies who are heavily focused on technology will 100% remove it. It will always be a combination of traditional plus the technological companies. Like what we say that
At
legacy
least
system.
in the short run, I would say yes.
Okay.
In the long run, I mean, it is anybody's guess. So
Hmm.
yeah, I would say I can comment on 3 to 5 year horizon. Yes, I would
Okay.
say that the traditional players would, and they have found in the I have seen a lot of traditional players also evolving with time.
Correct.
I have a fond of traditional players who have gone on to become technology enabled. It is not that somebody else is coming from outside the domain and creating their expertise in technology. It is these traditional players who understood the importance of technology, and sort of and now they are slowly enabling themselves with these sort of technology levers to ensure that they better utilize their assets.
Correct. Correct. Got it. Got it. Yes, you're rightly covered by you this part. That I also agree on the same thought process that this is how it will work in the and yes, I also know few companies. The new generation has come, like the father was running this business for like 25 years, logistics. Now they have come and now they are adding that visibility, how the trucks are moving. They are adding more fleet. They are expanding their fleet also. They are going to the same customers and telling them that now we have these options as well. So with the same relationship, we will make you more technologically, what should I say, educated, that you don't have to go to someone else, and we will provide you end-to-end solutions. Yeah, so yeah, correct. The last section of this discussion, we covered majority of the key points. Still, I feel that one discussion is very small to cover this topic. It's a very big topic. You know better than me. In terms of key skills, for example, someone has to grow a career in logistics part of the supply chain, or someone who does not know this part of supply chain, they see this, they watch this video, they feel, okay, this is an interesting space, we want to get into this space. So irrespective of finding a job or applying for it, if someone has to understand, okay, these are the skills, soft or technical skills, which would help him or her to perform well in this role. So, what would that be, according to you? So that people can focus on that part just to help uh, get into this space if possible.
I mean, again, they, it depends from organization to organization, depends on
Yes, yes.
the
Generally,
kind of
generally, like
logistics
I
setup
know
that
that
is there.
generally,
But
if you say, yeah.
yeah, but I think one common theme which is there across the logistics
Mm.
background is the ability to ensure flawless execution. So your
Okay,
plan will not mean anything at the end of the day if you're not able to execute it on, which is
okay.
why I would say that any person who would want to do that effectively should have an exposure to operations in terms of primary transportation, secondary transportation, handling a warehouse. So, ability to execute, getting things done essentially from others is something that would work. The other part of it is the ability to ensure execution without formal authority. The ability to influence without formal authority is something which is
Mm,
key for any organization. Why? Because if you look at the logistics setup, majority of the logistics setup, specifically in the product industry, is run by others.
mm,
It is outsourced, right? So
yes,
you directly sitting here, I do not control directly 35 plus warehouses that I have. Essentially, they are run by different players, and then there have to be checks and balances which are there. There have to be processes which are there to ensure that uh, organizations have ample control over the process which is being run in these warehouses through others. So I
yes.
would say these are two key points which are there from an execution standpoint.
Okay.
The second part of it is which I feel has gone much more importance, and that I would not say only for logistics, I would say only for supply chain, is the ability to understand business.
Mm,
Because essentially, see, if you focus on supply chain rather than just being a function or logistics, just being a function to provide goods to the final consumer, has gone on to become a cost critical parameter.
mm,
And when if you need to have that, you need to understand the P&L better. You need to understand your ability to ensure, say, capex, what does an x amount of capex versus an x amount of opex means, what is the impact that is going to create on the final customer, what is a part, why a customer is buying a certain thing, why the customer is not buying a certain thing,
mm,
which category of customers deal how, why a particular BTL has got X impact in the market. So I think a lot of it has to be an emphasis on understanding the business side of it.
mm,
Essentially, not being very limited to the core supply chain concepts, but as you grow, essentially your role in supply chain would be more of a business contributor. So you will be directly impacting P&L, and probably more than any other functions
mm.
than in a typical product industry. So your ability to understand business is something that has to be there. So I would say even somebody who's looking a career in logistics who has not spent time in logistics or has no background of supply chain might act as a big catalyst to to a
Mm,
team like say mine, wherein you need to have that understanding of business to be able to contribute better to
mm.
service as well as cost.
Correct, correct. No, no, I think execution and business overall, and then you explain the
Yes,
nuances.
so these are two points I would say.
Correct, correct. Agree, agree. So I think I have covered all the key points for today. And I'm sure that someone who will watch this video will be able to understand about logistics, what are the key things which need to be addressed from the business point of view, how it works also, which we briefly covered. And then at the end, we covered about skills and then the challenges of the Indian landscape as well. So thanks a lot, Arpit. Thanks a lot for your time today and all the inputs. I hope you enjoyed the today's discussion. I hope I was able to ask the relevant questions. So if anything is missed, feel free to let me know. We can cover that part as well.
No, I think first, I think thank you, Maninder, for organizing this. And specifically similar to this, I've seen your uh, other topics that you have covered specifically on the changing trends in supply chain. I think that's a very good initiative for somebody who's a novice, or otherwise somebody who's inexperienced to maybe have a very different view to supply chain, specifically of the kind of diverse background that you bring into the podcast. I think that is significant. In terms of, I think you've covered the majority of the topics which are there relevant specifically for somebody as layman, as somebody who no more remotely related to supply chain logistics would be able to understand. So I think that's fairly well covered. Thank you again for making me a part of this particular podcast, and looking forward to seeing more such videos in the future as well.
Thanks, Arpit. Thank you very much.